Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister's demand for an early general election looks set to be rejected by MPs after opposition parties agreed it shouldn't take place until after the EU summit in mid-October. Labour, the Lib Dems, the SNP and Plaid Cymru all agreed not to support the government, declaring they wanted an extension to the leave date of October the 31st to guarantee no Brexit without a deal. Mr Johnson, on a visit to Scotland, accused them of making an extraordinary political mistake. It came as the House of Lords approved a bill to prevent a no-deal Brexit. It will get royal assent and become law on Monday. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar.
Here we go.
Much easier this than leading the country. Boris Johnson's trying to call an election before Brexit, to stick to his plan, leave on time, deal or no deal. But he's lost control and he wants it back.
We must get Brexit done, and that's my message to my colleagues. Let's come together, get this thing over the line and unite our country, and then get on with defeating the Labour opposition, you know, when they finally have the guts to have an election.
You can almost smell the election coming, but he's having to wait. A spectator as his opponents try to force him to give up on a no-deal Brexit, break his promise, maybe his premiership.
You keep mentioning October the 31st. You've made it abundantly clear that's your line in the sand. If you can't deliver that, you're going to have to resign, aren't you?
That is not a hypothesis I'm willing to contemplate. I want us to get this thing done.
Today in the Lords, the legislation banning no deal was sent to become law, decreeing there'd be no election till Brexit's delayed.
As many of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content, the contents have it.
Opponents had coordinated their plans.
We've agreed that we're not going to give the Prime Minister the general election he is so desperate for until an extension is secured and the risk of no deal is completely eliminated.
The Prime Minister is on the run. Boris is broken. We have an opportunity to bring down Boris, to break Boris and to bring down Brexit, and we must take that.
I want an election, the SNP wants election, but we will do that when we make sure that the security of our citizens is determined.
And you want to weaken Boris Johnson ahead of that election by making him break his word.
Well, he has gone out with ridiculous promises of leaving the European Union on the 31st of October. Boris Johnson, that's not going to happen.
No sight of Jeremy Corbyn, though he gathered opposition leaders by phone. Labour's Brexit policy is still a work in progress. But the parties joined the alliance that's cornered Boris Johnson. And in Downing Street, they're searching for a plan, any plan that'll somehow help the PM regain some kind of control.
He's sworn he'll never seek an extension to Brexit, but now a new law could force him to do just that. He won't break his word, he can't break the law. Mr Johnson needs to find a way to force an election or salvage his plan to deliver Brexit, maybe without reaching an EU deal first. And in there's no sign they've found one.
We ask you for an extension, Mr Frost.
What chance of a last-minute deal? Britain's Brexit negotiator, David Frost, has been in Brussels today, but the Finnish PM, who's chairing the EU, suggested a no-deal exit could be close.
It seems very obvious that we are not getting Brexit with agreement.
110! 110!
On with the whites and off to Peterhead Market. Campaigning keeps you busy. Haggling's part of the job.
£50 per fish.
Good God, that's an expensive fish.
Boris Johnson's famously upbeat, but his premiership could still end badly.
And John is in Downing Street for us this evening. John, have Boris Johnson's tactics this week misfired?
Well, Rita, as good weeks go for Boris Johnson, this hasn't been one. Defeated in the Commons, then defeated again, today beaten in the House of Lords. He's under pressure now from some colleagues to reprieve at least some of those rebels that he had thrown out as Conservative MPs. Today he was talking about building bridges, trying to sound conciliatory, but today more and more Tories are saying they'll stand down at the next election, and they look like joining, reinforcing Boris Johnson's critics. Now, as for Brexit and the election. We'll see on Monday another attempt by Boris Johnson to get approval for an early election, and that will surely fail. Then the options on the table in Downing Street, well, they range from quitting office in the hope of getting back in again on Boris Johnson and the government's terms, to hoping the EU denies Britain the extension to Brexit that Boris Johnson so badly wants to avoid. Now, if this is a cunning plan, and a lot of people, including in the government, including in the Tory party, don't believe it is, it seems to need more work, and soon.
John, thank you. Deputy Political Editor there, John Pienaar. The High Court has rejected a legal challenge to Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament. The case was brought by the businesswoman Gina Miller, who argued the move was an unlawful abuse of power. She's been allowed to appeal. That case is expected to be heard at the Supreme Court on September the 17th. A similar legal challenge was rejected at Edinburgh's Court of Session earlier this week. That is also being appealed. The Chief Constable of West Yorkshire Police says he's disappointed that his officers were used as a backdrop to a political speech by Boris Johnson on Brexit yesterday. John Robbins said it was the understanding of the force that any involvement of their officers was solely about the government's police recruitment drive, and that they'd had no prior knowledge the speech would be broadened to other issues.
Boris Johnson's week to forget has ended with his Brexit plans looking more doomed than ever. A new bill preventing Britain leaving without a deal in October has passed its final stage in the Lords before it becomes law. The government will ask MPs again on Monday to vote for a general election, but an opposition alliance made it clear today they won't support it. That could kill off Mr Johnson's controversial plans, and his next step is unclear, as our political correspondent Romilly Weeks reports.
Boris Johnson is a man with an election plan, just no election. Hitting the campaign trail complete with snazzy wellies and jovial banter.
£50 per fish. Good God, that's an expensive fish.
As though the opposition parties hadn't just blown apart his whole strategy. Because if Keane the Bull was proving a little unwilling to be led by the nose,
Good boy. Here we go.
That's nothing compared to the MPs lining up against him in their determination not to give him a way out of the hole he's in with an early election date.
They've said no to that, which is curious. They don't trust the people. They don't want an election. OK. Perhaps it is that they don't think that they will win. Fine. I'll go to Brussels. I'll get a deal, and we'll make sure we come out on October the 31st. That's what we've got to do.
The Prime Minister's options are closing in after Labour, Plaid, the Greens, Lib Dems and the SNP agreed today they won't be voting for an election until after a delay to Brexit is secured.
He's not going to determine the time of the election. We will. There is an election coming. We want that chance to remove Boris Johnson, but we will do that when we're in a position of safety where we've extended Article 50, where we can't crash out.
And this was the moment in the Lords today that binds the Prime Minister's hands yet further, forcing him to ask for a Brexit delay if he can't get a deal.
This bill do now pass.
So what next? On Monday, the government is set to put forward another vote for a general election, even though it's certain to fail. Parliament will then be prorogued or suspended sometime between Monday and Wednesday for 5 weeks, meaning MPs will return before the European Council on the 17th and 18th, with the Prime Minister now legally obliged to secure a deal or ask for an extension by October the 19th.
I think we also all realise that a general election before the 31st of October, or by the 31st of October, comes loaded with a huge amount of risk, and the risk that we could still crash out of the European Union, and therefore an election from the 1st of November onwards is safer.
And in a further knockback for Downing Street, West Yorkshire Police's Chief Constable said he was disappointed his officers had been used as a backdrop to the Prime Minister's speech yesterday. Boris Johnson had time for a photo opportunity by a rather unaptly named trawler today before a truncated visit to the Queen at Balmoral. She must be wondering when anything approaching tranquility will return to these shores. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
Well, there's more embarrassment for the Prime Minister tonight. As it emerged, he called predecessor David Cameron a girly swat for making MPs sit longer hours. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Libby Vina, who's over at Westminster for us. Libby, how has this come to light?
Well, this comment appeared in a note produced in court this week. That court considering whether Boris Johnson was right to prorogue Parliament. Now, those proceedings failed, but some interesting detail about that note has emerged. Originally, it was presented to the court with some bits blacked out, that is redacted, but Sky News has a copy which is unredacted, and it shows that not only did Boris Johnson think that the extra sitting days for Parliament were a rigmarole, but they were introduced by, in his words, girly swat Cameron. Yes, that's a reference to his predecessor in number 10, David Cameron. Now, the two men do have a history of some rivalry which dates back to their school days and university. One bone of contention is that whereas Mr. Cameron got a first-class honours degree, Boris Johnson only got a second-class degree. What Mr. Cameron makes of it all, we don't yet know, but perhaps it is preferable being called a girly swat than a big girl's blouse, which is what Mr. Johnson called the leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, this week.
Indeed. Libby, thanks very much.
Boris Johnson has arrived at the Queen's summer residence at Balmoral tonight, a man with rapidly dwindling political options. Opposition leaders have roundly rejected his call for a general election next month, and the bill blocking a no-deal Brexit is now heading for royal assent. Mr. Johnson declared he had never known an opposition in the history of democracy that's refused to have an election. But with the European Union refusing to renegotiate the Brexit deal, Parliament has now effectively boxed the Prime Minister into a corner. Our political correspondent Paul McNamara is at Balmoral. Paul.
Yes, here we are outside Balmoral for the second time in 2 weeks. This time, though, less unexpected and less controversial than we were here last week, and the government were here to ask the Queen to suspend Parliament. This weekend, Boris Johnson himself is here for the annual visit with the Queen host the Prime Minister, and not just the Prime Minister. We believe she's also hosting the Prime Minister's partner, Carrie Symonds. The first time we believe that a sitting Prime Minister has brought along his unmarried partner. Not a bad weekend retreat, though, especially after what has been a bruising few days in Westminster, where he returns tomorrow. The Prime Minister has had some good news today, though. A High Court challenge over that decision to suspend Parliament, brought by businesswoman Gina Miller, has been thrown out by the High Court. The Prime Minister has also taken the opportunity to visit some farms up in Scotland and announce a further £50 million worth of funding to Scottish farming. As you can imagine, that went down very well with the farmers that we've spoken to. But there's no two ways about it. This has been the toughest week the Prime Minister has had since getting into office. This is how the last day of it played out.
Crack of dawn at the end of a week, he may well be happy to see the back of. Votes lost, his majority lost, his own brother in cabinet lost. But in good mood in Aberdeenshire this morning as he practiced his negotiating skills.
Have I bought that? How much was it? Nice cash.
How much? The fish traders told us, well over the odds.
Good God, that's an expensive fish.
A deal, though, good or bad, he will have to strike now if he doesn't want to delay Brexit.
This bill do now pass.
After this happened in the House of Lords.
Say content. The country not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg the House do now adjourn.
And with that, no-deal Brexit effectively blocked. So no deal is off the table, so too is an early general election, blocked this afternoon by an agreement between opposition parties.
I think Boris Johnson is being forced to acknowledge we live in a parliamentary democracy and not a dictatorship. And he is trying to behave in a kind of presidential dictatorial fashion, but that isn't in keeping with British values. You govern through Parliament. Parliament is sovereign, and that's all we're asserting. Beyond that, when we get to a general election, I think it will be a Remain-Leave general election.
So, struggling to make things go his way, opposition parties will only agree to an election now after the EU summit in mid-October. That means he'll have to sniff out a deal before then if he's to make good on his October 31st do-or-die promise. No problem, he says.
If I may say so, I think that they're making an extraordinary political mistake, but it's their decision. They don't want to have an election. They don't want to move this thing forward. Fine. We will get a deal on October the 17th, 18th, and then we'll come out of the EU. But that will be the beginning of a process in which we start a new partnership with our European friends, plus we look to new opportunities around the world.
The Prime Minister was in Scotland today, pledging an extra £50 million to Scottish farmers on top of a £160 million boost announced earlier this week. And the place to declare it? A serene, sprawling, award-winning beef farm in the Scots Tory heartland of Aberdeenshire.
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit of light relief for the Prime Minister.
Do you think he needs it at the moment?
He's having a tough time, so yeah.
Peter doesn't care what deal Mr Johnson gets now, as long as it gets done.
We were quite happy to have him because we like the idea of being out of Brexit. You know, this thing needs to stop. So I was quite happy, deal or no deal, right or wrong. We are in limbo just now, and we've been in limbo for 3 years. And not just this industry, I speak to every other industry, and they're the same. And I speak to very few people who don't think the same. Let's get out and deal with the eventualities once we're out.
So there he goes, £200 million lighter. But the Prime Minister's problems in Scotland extend far further than the farming industry. A poll this week said he could lose 10 of his 13 MPs. This is the Prime Minister in electioneering mode, and up here he stands on the shakiest of ground.
When the week started, it looked possible the Prime Minister may force through a no-deal Brexit and an election. Now neither seemed possible. He fired 21 from his own herd, and the man who wanted to unite the nation has only managed to unite his opponents.
Paul McNamara reporting there. Well, as Paul mentioned, the opposing parties have united to oppose Boris Johnson's demand for an early election. The Prime Minister called it an extraordinary political mistake. But have they now scuppered Mr Johnson's chances of getting the UK out of the EU on the 31st of October? Fatima Manji is with me now. Fatima.
Cathy, I think the mood in Westminster today has been really interesting because we are hearing the opposition parties much more united, much more optimistic at the idea of stopping Boris Johnson's plans, and that's unusual. It's a sort of newfound optimism, if you like. So Jeremy Corbyn held that conference call this morning. Lib Dems, Plaid Cymru, SNP all involved in this. I spoke to various party spokespeople afterwards, and they're all telling me how well it went, how they're very much united for the moment on what the priority should be, which is to get Prime Minister Boris Johnson to either agree a deal or force him to go and get an extension on the 19th of October at this EU summit. So very much clear about that, and that there should be no election before then. On Monday, the MPs from all of these parties are going to be whipped to either abstain or vote against. Lib Dems were actually very categorical that their MPs will be voting against. Here's what Ian Blackford, leader of the SNP, had to say.
Yes, we want an election, but we're not going to do it under his terms. We'll have an election once we've secured that safety of knowing that we're staying in the European Union, at least in the short term.
So the Prime Minister is basically your prisoner now?
Yes, he is. Well, he's made some, quite frankly, ridiculous statements about do or die. Well, he's responsible for what he's said. The fact of the matter is, parliamentarians have done their job. They're sent to Parliament to represent their constituents. This isn't the people against Parliament, it's Parliament against Boris Johnson, who is behaving like a dictator.
If all the opposition parties are united about what happens on Monday, what about beyond that?
Yeah, interesting. How long does this spirit of unity last? Now, not going to get into the business of predictions, Cathy, but I think there was a little bit of caution from Labour coming, and they seemed a little bit lukewarm about what happens beyond Monday. Notable, there weren't very many senior Labour voices around today speaking up. Now, Labour have been pushing for an election for a long time. They are also under pressure from the Tories, who are running this slightly absurd campaign of presenting Jeremy Corbyn as a chicken. So bear that in mind. Labour haven't completely ruled out a motion of no confidence against Boris Johnson, although clearly that's not going to happen on Monday. If they are going to do it, that could obviously trigger an election. Haven't got long though. On Thursday, Parliament is set to be prorogued. So what could happen? Not sure.
What could happen? The question at the moment. Fatima, thanks very much. Well, with me now is the Labour MP Catherine West, and her constituency of Hornsey and Wood Green in London secured the highest Remain vote in the EU referendum. Fatima mentioned chickens there. Let's begin with that, because the Conservative press office sent pieces of chicken round the press gallery today. Are you chicken about a general election?
Not at all. I think the window's closing on the mandate of this Parliament, and that's quite obvious with everyone moving parties and all the rest of it. It's really important that we do have the general election, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that at the moment the opposition is actually in control of Parliament. So we don't want to waste this opportunity to really ram home the important message that a no-deal Brexit there's no majority for that in Parliament.
OK, so when are you going to be brave enough to actually go for a general election?
Well, I think the reason that there's a little bit of doubt in it is that it's important with tactics not to spell everything out, because there is a bit of a wargaming going on. I think it's important.
It's a bit cynical, isn't it, really?
Well, I think the important thing is that there is a passion for the election, and I think that was quite obvious from all sides in the chamber this week.
It's a fairly tepid passion when it comes to Jeremy Corbyn, isn't it?
The thing is that each minute of the day there's something different happening on the Tory side. So every time you sort of think that you understand the picture, then Michael Fallon will resign and say he's not going to stand again, or Joe Johnson, or so, you know, I think that the picture keeps changing. But the essence of it is let's make sure that we don't get tricked by Mr. Johnson into somehow allowing to slip through into a no-deal Brexit.
So you could wait till December to actually have the guts to go for an election?
Well, personally, I think we would all like an election as soon as possible. We're all raring to go. But I think equally we want to make sure that we wouldn't allow this no deal to slip through around that Halloween deadline.
Well, as I understand it, your policy is to have a second referendum and to put Remain on the paper as a choice. Yes. How convinced are you that Jeremy Corbyn himself will go full throttle for Remain?
Well, he certainly campaigned in my constituency for Remain on the day of the election on the 23rd of June 2016.
Just on the day.
And I also think that the membership of the Labour Party, once it settles down to looking at the actual manifesto and what we will be saying once we do have the general election, and I'm sure that there'll be debates about this at the conference, is that we will be saying that we want to remain in the European Union. You know, the economy has already contracted by a percentage point. A lot of the indicators in terms of whatever you look at, be that house prices, be that the pound, the drop in sterling, the fact that, you know, there are a number of other possible negative things on the horizon in terms of job losses or inflation or, you know, interest rates going up.
And yet you've equivocated over Brexit. And do you think that equivocation has cost you votes, that people are switching to the Lib Dems, in your seat particularly, which was very strongly Remain?
Certainly the European elections were a wake-up call for Labour in general. Obviously for myself, I'm completely in line with the way that people voted in the election in terms of remaining in the EU.
You're quite in line with the Lib Dems, though. Would you consider jumping ship if Jeremy Corbyn doesn't really get his back behind?
No, because I do believe in the essence of the Labour Party being for working people, and I think that's a very important element of my own politics. But I will be doing all I can to make the case for remaining in Europe, particularly also from a foreign affairs point of view, that we're much better when we're stronger within our own region as a voice in terms of all the big political issues and the foreign policy.
Catherine West, thanks very much. And Jacob Rees-Mogg has apologised for comparing an NHS doctor to a disgraced anti-vaccine campaigner. The Commons leader faced criticism by England's chief medical officer for comparing Dr David Nicholl to Andrew Wakefield in Parliament on Thursday. Dr Nicholl was the author of the medical section of the government's report into the potential effects of leaving the EU without a deal. Meanwhile, West Yorkshire's Chief Constable says he's disappointed his officers became a backdrop for yesterday's speech by Boris Johnson, which others have described as purely political. John Robbins said he had no prior knowledge of the Prime Minister's intentions. So far, Downing Street hasn't directly addressed the remarks, but the Labour chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Yvette Cooper, has asked the Cabinet Secretary for answers to a series of questions about the event, saying it raised serious concerns. Here's our senior Home Affairs correspondent, Simon Israel.
It was all supposed to be about police recruitment. The visit had been organised by Number 10 to launch the drive for 20,000 extra officers. Before the controversial speech, it had all been going well. Then, Boris Johnson slipped into political campaign mode.
I hate to be party political, but that is the sad reality, the approach of Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, because at the moment he won't. Not only are they voting to make it impossible for this country to decide on its own to leave the EU, but they're also making it possible for the people of this country to have an election.
There was, according to those there, no warning and no notice that there was a change to the agenda. West Yorkshire's Chief Constable John Robbins said in a statement today,
"It was the understanding of West Yorkshire Police that any involvement of our officers was solely about police officer recruitment. We had no prior knowledge that the speech would be broadened to other issues until it was delivered. Minutes before the speech, we were told that the NPAS visit and subsequent brief to a small media pool had been cancelled. I was therefore disappointed to see my police officers as a backdrop to the part of the speech that was not related to recruitment."
West Yorkshire's Police and Crime Commissioner is preparing to lodge a complaint with Downing Street.
There were trainee officers who quite frankly shouldn't have been put in that position for what was obviously a political speech, because the majority of what he went on about was Brexit, the opposition and a potential general election. I think clearly some harsh lessons need to be learned here, and hopefully West Yorkshire Police won't get burnt again like that in terms of what happened yesterday.
Yvette Cooper has beaten him to lodging the first complaint. The chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee tonight sent this letter to the Cabinet Secretary, raising serious concerns that the Prime Minister had failed to respect the impartiality of the police. She asks,
"Are you satisfied that the ministerial code and relevant guidance concerning the impartiality of the police was consulted and followed in the organisation and management of the event?"
Downing Street did not refer to any of the comments from West Yorkshire in its response. It simply said that the visit was a chance to see firsthand the training of police recruits.
Now, if there were to be an election, how might Boris Johnson's Conservatives get on? According to a poll by YouGov earlier this week, the Tories currently have a 10-point lead over Labour if there was a snap vote. But in Scotland, just 1 in 5 said they'd vote Conservative, wiping out the party's previous gains. Aberdeen could be lost to the SNP, while seats in the south, like Lewis, could go to the Lib Dems as Brexit drastically redraws the political map. In all, Conservative strategists think the party could lose between 25 to 30 seats, but they're hoping that the Remain vote could be split in places like Bolsover and Wolverhampton, allowing them to pick up the 50 seats they'd need for a majority. Well, joining me now is John Curtis, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University. John Curtis, perhaps you can make sense of it. If Boris Johnson hasn't delivered Brexit, how successful might he be in an election in the next few weeks?
If he the honest truth is, I don't think we expect Boris Johnson to deliver Brexit before the 15th of October, which is what he wants. The question now is whether or not he can deliver Brexit by the 19th of October, which is the deadline that the new anti-no-deal Brexit legislation effectively imposes on him. And certainly, potentially, the nightmare that faces Mr. Johnson is that if he indeed, in the end, is forced to apply to the European Union for an extension because he either has a deal that he can't get through the House of Commons, or he's trying to go for no deal and the House of Commons says no, which seems very likely, then what impact does that have on his credibility amongst Leave voters? Mr. Johnson, in the course of recent weeks, this is why he has the lead, like the 10-point lead in the YouGov poll over Labour, has been squeezing the Brexit Party vote. He's been winning over Leave voters, and that's been the crucial foundation upon which the potential opportunity for him to at least contemplate an election has arisen. But, and there's been some polling published today which confirms this, but it's been there in previous polls. Certainly when Leave voters are being asked, well, what would you do if we have an election after 31st of October and we haven't left the European Union? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, they're less likely to say they're going to vote Conservative, more likely to say they'd vote for the Brexit Party. And with, as a result, the Conservatives' ability to win those seats like Rotherham or Wolverhampton would potentially disappear.
Well, this strategy that he seems to be adopting, when you look at the fact that he went to Wakefield yesterday, of tackling Labour Leave seats, how effective do you think that might be? How staunchly Leave are those seats still, do you think?
Well, there is no doubt. I mean, the seats which are marginal between Labour and Conservative are pretty heterogeneous. There's some that are quite pro-Remain, quite a lot, however, that are quite pro-Leave. And there seems to be little doubt. Given that the Conservative vote now looks even more of a Leave vote than it did in 2017, given the dire position of the Labour Party in the polls, you've quoted 22, I'd say the average is 25, but it doesn't matter. These are even worse figures than Michael Fitt had in 1983. There is no doubt, therefore, that basically, given, as you've said, the Conservatives are at risk of losing ground in Scotland, losing some ground to Liberal Democrats, their prospects above all of getting an above-average swing in Labour seats are in Labour-held marginal seats, with a substantial Leave vote, and those are mostly in the Midlands and in the north of England.
And very briefly, in a sentence, a short sentence, the Lib Dems, any sign of a massive breakthrough? Jo Swinson thinks she can make it number 10.
There is clear evidence that she's going to do a lot better in terms of votes. The question, however, as ever for the Liberal Democrats, is how much they can turn that into seats.
Lots of questions more from that. John Curtis, thank you very much for joining us tonight.